A large, run-down townhouse was basking in the pink haze of sunrise. Once upon a time, laughter and singing would have floated through its rooms, but now the house was cold and dark. A young girl wakes as always in front of the glowing embers of the kitchen fire. This had not always been where she slept, but since the death of her mother, her stepsisters, Mona and Griselda, had treated her as their servant and given her the nickname Cinderella. Cinderella shivered in the cold, damp kitchen as she began her daily chores. As she swept the cold stone floor of the kitchen, she found herself daydreaming of a better time. Her dainty feet twirled around the empty kitchen as she imagined herself dancing as she once did with her mother. The warmth and joy of those memories filled her body, and for a fleeting moment, she was happy. Suddenly, a chill in the room reminded her where she was, and with a sigh, she put the broom down and went over to the fire to warm herself. At that moment, one of her stepsisters burst in. "Lazing around as usual, Cinderella!" Griselda shrieked. "Where's my petticoat?" Cinderella collected the petticoat she had been sewing and gave it to her sister, who snatched it ungratefully out of her hands and began dancing around the room. "Hey, that's my petticoat!" came another shrill voice from the entrance of the kitchen. Mona ran towards the petticoat, trying to snatch it from her sister. The ugly sisters yanked at each end of the petticoat when suddenly it ripped apart and Griselda fell with a thump onto the hard stone floor. Completely outraged, the sisters were very quick to blame Cinderella's sewing and demanded she fix the tear immediately. The sisters, scolding Cinderella for the petticoat, were interrupted by a fanfare announcing a royal invitation to the prince's ball. Each of the sisters were presented with invitations, but as the royal pages left their home, Griselda snatched and crumpled up Cinderella's invitation, not allowing her to go. "It's only for refined ladies like ourselves," they told her, "not for servants in tatty rags." Cinderella sighed. She didn't own any pretty clothes. Then the sisters hurried away to prepare themselves for the ball. Cinderella sighed. "I wish I could see the royal palace and dance at the ball." Cinderella's thoughts were interrupted by the appearance of an old woman who stood hunchbacked on the doorstep. "Could you spare me a crumb to eat?" she asked. Cinderella agreed without a second thought and kindly gave her some of the soup she had been saving for herself. The old lady drank the warm broth, thanking Cinderella for her kindness, and as she turned to leave, Cinderella stopped her and scurried about the kitchen collecting fresh bread and fruit to take with her on her journey. Cinderella was exhausted from her hard day of chores, so when she had a spare moment, she lay by the fire and dreamt. She dreamt of dancing embers spreading their warmth throughout the kitchen. Even as she woke, her dream lingered in her memory as she imagined herself dancing with the warm embers. Her daydream was stopped abruptly by a shriek from the kitchen entrance. "Don't we look divine?" cooed the sisters. Cinderella thought it best not to answer. You see, her stepsisters had dressed themselves in violently bright colours with absurdly large feathers sticking out of their elaborate wigs. They started to practice their dancing, asking Cinderella to join them, and almost forgot to leave for the ball, until they saw the clock on the mantel, and the two sisters hurried away to the ball, leaving Cinderella alone in the kitchen, wishing she could follow. Disappointment rose inside her, and she found herself welling with tears. Out of nowhere, the old lady had materialized into the kitchen. A sudden flourish of music alerted Cinderella to the intrusion, and she turned just in time to see the old lady transform, revealing a dazzling fairy with a shimmering blue dress and glistening magic wand. "Don't cry," said the fairy, her voice warm and soft. "I am your fairy godmother, and I'm here to take you to the royal ball." Cinderella was in awe of the magic fairy and watched as she danced around, leaving a trail of fairy dust that glittered inside the kitchen. Even with the fairy godmother's promise to get Cinderella to the ball, she had her doubts. "Fairy godmother, what am I to wear to the ball? I have nothing but rags. And how will I get there?" she asked. "Not to worry, child," answered the fairy godmother. "All we need is a touch of magic." And with a wave of her magic wand, a whole nest of mice scurried into the kitchen. The mice danced for Cinderella before a few were hand-selected by the fairy godmother. And with another wave of her magic wand, they became beautiful white horses. "These horses will help pull your carriage to the ball," the fairy godmother said with a smile. "Now we need some footmen." Out from under the stone floor scurried two scaly lizards. The lizards didn't like being disturbed, but after seeing the fairy godmother, they quickly calmed down and bowed to her. The lizards danced around the kitchen and, with a flick of the fairy godmother's wand, they grew into handsome footmen. "What's next?" the fairy godmother asked herself. "Oh, of course. We need a coachman." Just then, a big, wobbly grey rat stumbled out from behind one of the barrels. "Ah, perfect," she exclaimed. And with a gentle tap of her magic wand, the rat transformed into a coachman. "Last on the list," the fairy godmother began. "Cinderella, will you fetch me a large pumpkin from your garden, the biggest pumpkin you can find?" So Cinderella did what she was told, and brought the biggest pumpkin she could find to the fairy godmother. With a few taps of her magic wand, the pumpkin began to grow and grow, and then it began dancing around the room. The fairy godmother explained that the pumpkin was to become the carriage that would take Cinderella to the ball. Cinderella stared in amazement as the fairy godmother waved her wand once more. Only this time, the kitchen began to sparkle, and pots and pans faded away as Cinderella saw a beautiful scene materializing in front of her. She was greeted by a flurry of dancing fairies for each season. Cinderella watched spellbound as the freshness of spring blossomed into a hot, bright summer. Then, a gust of autumn gave way to a crisp, glistening winter. Cinderella was watching blissfully as the seasons each presented her with an item she could wear to the ball. A stunning tiara, a glimmering cloak, a beautiful golden dress, and glittering shoes. It was then that the fairy godmother gave Cinderella a warning. "You must leave the ball by midnight, for my magic will vanish at the last strike of the midnight bell." Cinderella left for the ball, her new ball gown flowing in the wind of the carriage. At the prince's palace, the ball had already started. Stately tunes from the orchestra filled the air, while the guests danced and admired the lavish ballroom. The court jester amused everyone with songs and jokes. When the ugly stepsisters arrived, the other guests turned and stared. "Do you think they escaped from a zoo?" the court jester whispered, making a group of ladies giggle behind their fans. The sisters didn't even notice, but marched confidently onto the dance floor. "I'm going to dance with the prince," said Griselda to her sister. "Look, there he is!" And she ran over to the man she was pointing at. "No, I'm going to dance with the prince." Mona whined and followed her sister, trying to butt into their dance. The man they were dancing with became horribly confused. You see, he was not the prince, but the prince's cavalier. Then, out of the corner of their eyes, the sisters spotted the real prince, sitting on his stool. "There's two?" the sisters exclaimed. They started walking towards the second prince when they were cut off by the cavalier. It was then they realised their mistake, and decided that if they couldn't dance with the prince, they would have to dance with each other, and they trotted clumsily around the floor. The festivities continued. Dancing and laughter bounced off every wall. The ball was suddenly interrupted by the arrival of a late guest. Everyone turned to see who dared arrive late to the prince's ball. Then, framed at the top of the staircase and glowing against the darkness of the hallway, stood Cinderella. She was so in awe of the ballroom she almost didn't see all the staring faces looking at her. She took a deep breath and slowly descended the stairs. The prince watched in wonder. He offered her his hand and guided her onto the dance floor, where they began to glide around the room as if they had been dancing together all their lives. "Oh, she's so graceful," whispered one of the guests. "She must be a princess," added another. On the edge of the dance floor, the ugly sisters stood scowling. "Who does she think she is, just waltzing in like that?" they muttered. Never would they have suspected they were talking about their own stepsister. When the dance came to an end, the prince called for refreshments. His servants came forward, announcing that refreshments were to be served in the next room. Each servant held an orange, the most exotic fruit in his kingdom, and he presented one to his Cinderella. Then, taking pity on the stepsisters, he gave them both one orange each. While the sisters bickered about whose orange was biggest, the prince and Cinderella tiptoed away and lost themselves in a magical dance in the now emptied ballroom. Cinderella wished the evening would last forever, but all too soon she heard bells chiming midnight and remembered the fairy godmother's warning. "I have to go," Cinderella gasped, suddenly looking for an exit, but the ballroom started to fill again and the exits were all blocked. "Please don't," said the prince. "I must," she replied, and in her panic she managed to slip away from his grasp and ran for the door. She fled the palace without a second glance, weaving through the other guests. Her ball gown had returned to the tattered rags she had always worn, and one of her shoes was missing. The poor prince rushed after her, but she was already lost from view. All that was left of his enchanting princess was a dainty glass slipper. Cinderella woke, as she always did, by the kitchen fire. She stirred the dying embers and then remembered a dream she had had. In the dream, she was at the prince's ball, and she wore a beautiful golden dress with a stunning tiara and sparkling glass slippers. She had also dreamt that the prince had chosen to dance with her. Cinderella daydreamed about dancing with the prince, and then, out of the corner of her eye, she spied the glimmer of gold catching light under her stool. She rushed over to discover it was one of the magical slippers. It wasn't a dream, she thought to herself, and overjoyed with the memories of the night's events, she placed the shoe into the pocket of her tattered dress. At that moment there was a huge slam that announced the arrival of the ugly sisters. "Oh, my poor feet," moaned Griselda, clumping into the room. "Undo this corset before it kills me," cried Mona. A sudden blast of trumpets made everyone jump. The sisters ushered Cinderella to hide in a dark corner just as the kitchen doors opened. In came the prince. There was purpose to his walk, and he spoke. "I intend to marry the girl that fits this slipper," he announced, "and I will travel the entire kingdom until I find her." "Travel no farther, my prince," cried Griselda. "It's me." She snatched the shoe from one of the courtiers and tried to ram it onto her foot. The slipper barely covered her toes. "Let me try," wailed Mona. But no amount of squeezing or tugging could make the slipper fit. Then Cinderella crept out from the darkness. The sisters glared at her as the prince commanded she try the slipper on. So she sat on her stool, took the dainty shoe, and slid it onto her foot. It was a perfect fit. "It's not her! It can't be!" the sisters cried. But then Cinderella took out the slipper she had hidden in her pocket and offered it to the prince. "It is you," he gasped. "But I am no princess. I'm only a poor girl in rags," Cinderella replied. To which the prince said, "Marry me and become my princess." He took her in his arms, and together they danced into the midnight sky, dressed once more in her magical golden gown.